Good morning, everyone. As a church, we're in the middle of a series looking at some of the big issues currently impacting society, aiming to have discussions as a church on some of these issues and also equip ourselves to have conversations with wider society so that we can help share God's perspective on issues, which can involve standing up for those who feel like they don't have a voice or bringing unity where there is division. Today, we're looking at the issue of race. We had a long series on race last year with lots of input provided by Paul Namuda. And this was in the light of the George Floyd killing, when there was a lot of public outcry and a lot of discussion around racism. Or the reporting in the papers on race may have died down, and while we may not be discussing race as much as a church and in our conversations, as much as we were, the issue of racism has not died down for those who are impacted by it. I'm going to start by reading a passage from the Bible. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to them, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and you love your neighbour as yourself." And he said to them, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. So, likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend I will repay you when I come back." "Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbour to the man who fell among the robbers?" he said. "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So a bit of context here. Jesus was Jewish, and a lot of the audience Jesus spoke to would have been Jewish, including the expert in the law. Now, the Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group who split from the Israelites and married Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. They had a long history of conflict with the Jews, and by this time, to the Jews, a Samaritan was more revolting than a Gentile. Samaritans were half-breeds who defiled the true religion. The Samaritans were a minority who were persecuted and hated because of their race. Now, I want you to think about how God sees different races. When I think about that question, I think of the beautiful imagery of heaven in the book of Revelations. Chapter 7, verse 9 says, "There, before me, was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." To me, that is a beautiful picture. People of all different races worshipping God together. I wish I could see that picture here on earth. How well do you think the global church represents that image? How well do you think the church in the UK represents that image? How well does the Journey Church represent that image? For me, the global church and the church in the UK has an issue with racism. You should love the minorities and the marginalised as you love yourself. If the church genuinely acted as Jesus said, by loving the minorities and the marginalised as you love yourself, I think churches would be diverse and multicultural places from the leadership down. I think a lot of churches can say that they want to be a church that is multicultural and diverse, but what that means is We want different cultures and races to come and adapt their behaviours to be like ours. They want everyone to be treated equally and everyone's issues are the same, ignoring the societal structures that put barriers in place for minorities. I think a multicultural church needs to be willing to have their views change on what church is, what good worship and preaching is. Have these views changed by the cultures and backgrounds of the people who attend the church. I think a multicultural church needs to be a community who is aware of the issues impacting minority groups and stands alongside and supports each other in those struggles, particularly around issues of justice and discrimination. Let me read you a section from one black lady's experience of churches in the UK. It isn't based on one church, but a number of different churches of different denominations that she attended. And it comes from the book We Need to Talk About Race by Ben Lindsay. Obviously, no two churches are the same. There are cultural and stylistic differences. However, in general, I've observed that where black majority churches readily speak on issues that affect the community, such as youth violence, unemployment, financial struggles, many of the white majority churches I've attended will speak more broadly on issues of the human condition, often neglecting to acknowledge the disproportionate struggles that minorities face. So as a black Christian woman, twice a minority, this sets the stage for my experience in white majority churches. While I don't expect a treatise on social justice from the pulpit every Sunday, here is how a typical service at a white majority church usually plays out for me. Enter church, exchange pleasantries, praise and worship come next, followed by a non-controversial preach. Closing prayer. Wishes for a lovely week ahead as we part ways. Smile, greet, preach, part, repeat. It's all very polite and inoffensive. And while there is nothing wrong with this routine, as a black woman, it leaves me with an underlying feeling of neglect that I've become accustomed to. Unfortunately, it's no different from what I experience outside of church, and church should be different from the world. There are serious issues black women contend with that affect our sense of identity, agency, and well-being, which are not recognised by the church. I really want to be able to lay my burdens down at church. I can't. For one thing, I don't want to be responsible for shattering that pleasant routine we have going. More critically, there simply isn't the space, the time, or the interest expressed in the broader church agenda. At church, I want my realities as a black woman to be acknowledged and addressed. I want to feel valued. I want to feel supported. I want practical advice on battling the institutional prejudices I face every day. I found the phrase, church leaves me with an underlying feeling of neglect that I've become accustomed to, particularly harrowing. As she said, church should be different from the world. So how do we become a community who make all people, but particularly people from minority groups, feel valued, to feel supported? The first step, and I think this is pretty obvious, is we need to know what the issues are. Unfortunately, these issues don't often make front page news. They may not even be reported about at all. These things aren't taught in schools. They don't have lots of films or Netflix series made about them, as they make the white Western world feel uncomfortable. So we have to do a bit more work to understand these things and the impacts they have on people's daily lives. We have to ask people questions to find out the issues affecting them. We can't make assumptions that we know what they are, but we need to be open about being educated. We can read books by authors from minority groups. I would recommend reading the book I read earlier by Ben Lindsay, among others. And now, I'm not claiming to have the best knowledge of the issues impacting minorities. I am a white man, and if I'm totally honest, I feel slightly uncomfortable giving this talk on race ahead of someone from a minority background. However, I also feel it's important to be an ally to minority groups and speak up for them when I have the chance. I wanted to share a couple of the large issues I have heard about when speaking with friends and family from minority groups, as well as well as incidents of people being spat at because of the colour of their skin, being stopped by police regularly, or being in lower sets at school than they should have been. These examples look at some of the structural inequality that is in place, the hurt caused by historical racism, and the current policies that still leave minorities feeling oppressed. So the first example I wanted to share is how the legacy of slavery still contributes to the structural inequality seen today. In many churches, the church is, and in some ways is rightfully, given credit for ending the slave trade. However, it is not ignored that the church contributed massively to the institution of slavery, with passages from the Bible even being used to justify slavery. It is also ignored that a large reason slavery was abolished was because in some areas slaves were fighting back, and meaning they were unsustainable to keep for slave owners. The white saviour rhetoric is spread without recognising the impact on or the actions of the slaves. Credit is given for abolishing slavery, however, the way in which it was done is not often talked about. When slavery was abolished, reparations were paid to wounded parties. Who do you think the reparations were paid to? The slaves? No. The countries the slaves were taken from? No. Reparations were paid to the slave owners who lost their slaves. And what made it worse was that the government took a lot of debt to pay those reparations to the white slave owners, and that debt took years to pay off. It was finally paid off in 2015, over 150 years after the slavery was abolished. And who paid that debt off? It was the public, working people, the freed slaves who got jobs. Even though slavery was abolished, the way it was done ensured wealth and power was kept with the whites, and systemic racism ensured black people in Britain felt oppressed. A lot of the white Western wealth exists today due to slavery. Wealth, benefits, and privilege I have been afforded as a white man living in the UK are built on the backs of the slave trade, and this does not seem fair. The second example I have is the hatred and hurt some minorities feel because of the way their predecessors were treated. Another less talked about piece of British history is the British Empire and the negative impacts it had on many cultures around the world. I have a friend who is Kenyan, and he married a white British woman. His grandmother at first refused to meet his wife due to the anger and hostility she had towards the British. She had suffered greatly at the hands of the British Army during the Mao Mao Uprising. I hadn't ever really heard a lot about the Mao Mao Uprising. I certainly hadn't been taught it at school. It was a war between Kenyan people and the British Army. The British Army treated the prisoners of war atrociously, keeping many thousands of Kenyan people in concentration camps similar to the ones used by Nazi Germany. The third example I have is the government policies that are still being made that make minorities feel oppressed. Recently, the Nationality and Borders Bill has been passed by the government in the House of Commons. It gives the government the ability to remove someone's citizenship without telling that person. The government cannot leave someone stateless. In other words, they can't remove the citizen of someone whose only citizen is British. However, they can remove the citizenship of someone with dual citizenship without telling them. This policy is designed to be used on high harm criminals, so a law-abiding citizen should not need to worry. However, it does mean that minorities with dual citizenship could be treated differently from solely British citizens for doing the same crime, creating a level of second-class citizens. It would also be naive to think that people are never found guilty of crimes they didn't commit, and therefore unjustly having their citizenship removed. A number of people I have spoken to feel this bill is racist, as it creates dual citizenship where people are treated differently dependent on their race. And given the history of some decisions the British government have made, such as the decisions made during the Windrush scandal. This policy leads to fear and a lack of security for minority groups. As I have heard the history of the way minority groups have been treated by this country, I am humbled by the number of wonderful people I know who come from ethnic minority groups, who live with this history every day and yet are kind, generous, loving people who help those in need, no matter what ethnic background they are from. I am reminded of the story of the Good Samaritan that we looked at earlier, coming to the aid of the man who had been beaten despite him being from a persecuted group. So, to finish, I want to ask you the following questions. How well do you know modern day Samaritans, the minority groups? And do you know the issues impacting these groups? Maybe you are from a minority group and have your own story of discrimination. Do you think people understand the hurt you feel? Can you share it with them? And finally, how can we be a church community who is aware of the issues impacting the minorities groups? How can we as a church be how can we as a church community be allies to those minority groups who feel persecuted against, standing alongside them and supporting them in their fights for justice? Thank you.